So everyone, my name's Josh Mitchell. You're in for best practices for translating websites. Thank you to our wonderful sponsors for this event. It's been kind of cool to see Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit come back after so many years of being gone. Yeah. A little about me. I'm currently the founder and principal consultant for M6L. So I basically work with organizations to do consulting and mentoring, usually of in-house teams. So it's a little bit unique. Instead of, coming in and bringing my own team and building a site, if there's an in-house team, let's say like a government or a university, I come in and I teach them how to Drupal the right way. So I'll teach them how to do CI/CD, Git flow, best practices, and theming, and back-end development, and all that kind of fun stuff. It's kind of a unique offering, so I'd like to mention it just because it's not what a lot of people do out there. I've been doing Drupal a long time. In fact, if you know my secret Drupal.org username, which, by the way, is Mobile Hippie, and there's a reason why I stopped using it and started using Joshua Wani when I became a manager. I didn't have hair this long back then. It's fun. Being a consultant, you just grow it all out, right? But I've been on Drupal forever. I mean, like 19 plus years at this point. Literally 19 years, 1 month as of this week. So my translation journey is kind of interesting. I've worked a lot in government. I was an applications manager for Multnomah County, Oregon for a time. There we had the Multnomah County Library, which is the third largest library in the states, the library system in the states, and had 21 branches and lots of checkouts and just kind of generally big library system, if you will.
You said the United States, or?
It's the third largest library system within the continental United States.
Okay,
So yeah,
I live in Portland too. So
yeah, we love our libraries in Portland, and it's been funded really well over the years too with different measures and stuff. So. You may also know me from Drupal.org. I was the CTO of the Drupal Association from 2014 to 2017. And we did a lot of cool work there in terms of being able to kind of work with some basic translations on some of the subsites. I did a stint with Johnson & Johnson, consulting with them and helping them with their global brand platform, which has, I think at the time I was working on it, they had like 300 plus brand sites for all the little like Tylenol, Clean and Clear, that kind of stuff. So I've worked on it on kind of that commercial side of things too. And then more recently, I've done some great work with Portland.gov in terms of helping them implement translation strategy for the City of Portland website. So if you've been to Portland.gov, that team is near and dear to me. Did a lot of mentorship with them for close to 5 years. So when we're talking about translations, I'm going to give you some best practices, and we're going to start with the one that I think is super important, which is know your audience. So first, to get a sense from this audience, how many of you are using Drupal's core translation on the sites that you work with? So almost all of you, okay. How many of you use the Google Translate widget to do client-side translation? No? Okay, I'm actually really glad to hear that because I have some slides about that. So when you're thinking about your audience that's coming to your site, there's some key metrics that you need to think about that are more than just total top languages by user. You need to be thinking about what is the content that has the highest language access usage. So a good example in government sites is you're going to have much higher traffic from native speakers to services that service everyone, right? Because it's an equity thing at that point. So when you're thinking about your language access, don't think about it just from your kind of site-wide statistics, but drill down into the specific pages and know your audience for those pages. That means working with content strategists, working with marketing departments that are trying to target those language users. Okay? This is where I was saying, if you've got the Google Translate widget going, I don't know how many of you know, but Google actually deprecated that just prior to 2020 and the start of the pandemic. And then they, kind of de-deprecated it because they had all these governments saying, hey, no, we need it because we can't provide translation for all of this important content about COVID-19. I think that was a disservice, actually, the fact that they undeprecated it, if you will. It's still only allowed for non-commercial usage. I've seen some people that have used it in some crazy ways. I've got a few examples here. So here you can see Seattle.gov. By the way, I picked all Northwest examples just so we can pick on ourselves, right? So Seattle.gov, you can see here that they've passed it into the Translate widget. You see the Google Translate up in the top there. Translated to Spanish. And immediately, there's a few issues that you can see just with this first example. Seattle.gov, it's not a separate page for the other language. You know, you're looking at the English URL. That means it's only being presented into the browser. It's not being indexed in that language by search engines. So you have no visibility to the page. You just have to hope that somebody speaking the language gets to the page, and then they use the translation widget. The other thing I will say about the translation widget is it's not even really needed. I mean, if you look at Washington.gov or WA.gov, they don't have a translate widget on here at all, which if you're going to not do real translation, this is actually what I would recommend. Just let the browser do it, because frankly, if you're a non-English speaker and you're hitting an English site, you're likely aware of the things in your browser that will actually do the translation for you. If you're using Google Chrome and your system language is set to Spanish, it's going to say, hey, do you want to translate this to Spanish? And so you can do some things as a non-native speaker that will help you kind of get through translation. But honestly, if you're not going to provide it, let that be the case. Because what you're really saying is, I don't care about providing the translated content. Here's another example that I thought was hilarious. City of Vancouver, British Columbia. When you click on their translate icon in the top, which by the way is written in English, so you're relying on that icon to convey all the meaning that there's translation on this site. I click on that icon, I take into this translation page where they basically say, don't blame us, we didn't provide this translation. And my favorite part of that is that when you do actually pick the language, once again you are presented with an action button in English. So this is all just really solid examples of the client-side crutch. Here's another example from Oregon.gov, lest people think I was not picking on anybody in the state of Oregon, because that's where I'm from. I went looking, like, what's a really multicultural city that should be doing this right? And here's another example, LAcity.gov. When you click their translate icon, they don't even provide the word translate. It's just a little icon up in the top corner there. It pops up with a modal that has Google Translate. So not only are we, using the word Google Translate and this kind of opaque process to getting to content, we put it in a modal, so likely it's inaccessible as well, which is something that's kind of interesting. Don't forget your other language speakers, non-native speakers, also have accessibility needs, so we've got to consider that as well. I don't have a special slide for this one because I thought it'd be kind of weird to have just like a stock photo of somebody reviewing content. But when you do translation and you're doing real translation, another best practice is to make sure that every single translation is actually reviewed by a human. Even with the improvements that we're seeing in AI right now, it's always going to be critical to get somebody who actually speaks the language to review it. That said, I will say, having worked on the city of Portland, we ran all of our interface translations through a company that provided translations, and I think we started out with 7 languages. It happened to include Vietnamese, Chinese, and Spanish, which we had Vietnamese, Chinese, and Spanish speakers on our dev team. We also ran all of that same interface translation through the Google Translate API using the translation management module. And all of our staff, hands down, said that Google did a better job than the service. So what I'm saying there is, make sure it's a real human professional. But if you have staff or community that can actually double check those professional translation services, do so. Because you're paying them by the word to translate. They also are using translation APIs and translation engines, and they're kind of pushing it off to be translated for pennies on the dollar. So it's really important if you're doing this to try to get those community members to come in and help you do some verification. Go ahead.
I'm just curious if you're willing or able to say the name of the service that you use that was if you recall, that was.
I don't think it would be professional of me to
Yeah.
record it on a presentation,
Yeah, I
but I can look up the name and share it with you if you're interested afterwards. Because I wouldn't, it's not that they did a bad job, it's that they did an incomplete job and it was word choice. It's like, you know, when you have 2 or 3 words that mean, that are basically the same word, but they mean something different. They didn't nail the word choice all that well based on context. Like, this is a navigation item versus this is the word for it when talking about it colloquially to a friend. That sort of thing. That context wasn't there in their translations, which really should be, because your translations matter in context, right? What that word is in the nav bar versus in a headline. There's an important difference there in terms of what word might be chosen by the translator.
I think you mentioned, so you had humans review translations from 2 different sources, is that what you said?
Yes, so the 2 different sources were a translation agency, human translators, and using Google Translate API using translation management. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide.
Did you ever run, so we mostly only ever have to work with Spanish, and I'm a Spanish speaker, so we have a few people on our team where, like, I can say, yeah, that makes sense, or that's correct, but someone might say, well, actually, that might either be like a slang thing, or depending on what Spanish speaker, like, do you often run into that? That's me with Spanish. I don't know if it's the same with other languages. Like,
It is absolutely the case with other languages. What you're describing in terms of, and I'm going to kind of reword this to make sure it gets picked up on audio, but when you speak a particular like regional dialect of a language, your word choice might differ from someone else. And that is absolutely the case. It's important to consider that in translation as well. Are you targeting Spanish from Spain, or are you targeting Spanish from Mexico, or are you targeting Spanish from any particular country in South America, really? Because there's differences for every country in terms of the slang that they're going to use, and that becomes really important. And I have some hope for that as well, which I'll talk about a little bit further on in the presentation. So, aside from doing the human review, I want to talk about some of the technical aspects of translations that I've learned from some of those bigger projects. One of the things you need to do with translation is help out the search engines, right? If you're taking the time to translate content, that means you expect people to search for it using their language. They're not going to google.com, they're going to es.google.com, you know, that sort of thing, where they're actually going to a search engine as index pages in the language that they speak. So we'll start with the most basic tag for this, which is the lang tag, which gets applied to the HTML element of your page. The HTML element, the lang tag is made up of 2 parts. If your site is exclusively in the US and is clearly a US site, you don't actually have to use the -US. But if you're a global brand where maybe you're presenting content in Canada and Great Britain and it's actually different content for each of those markets, it becomes really important to include the country code as well. And there's an ISO standard for all of these that can be looked up in terms of language codes and country codes and how they get combined together. So this is telling us it's English in the US. The other important aspect of this is direction. Most of us, I'm assuming all of us in this room, speak a left to right language. There are languages that read from right to left. So if you're translating into Arabic or Farsi, which both use the Arabic alphabet, or if you're translating into Hebrew, all of those actually read right to left, which is another reason not to use that client-side crutch, because when Google Translate translates a page into Arabic, it actually lists it left to right, and all of your context gets kind of crazy. Another kind of interesting thing about right to left languages, I've met with some really earnest editors that wanted to do it right, and they transposed all of the phone numbers for a page translated into Arabic. That's not how it works. They read right to left, except when they see a number, and then the number is read left to right. So the fact that they transposed all those numbers actually made the phone number completely useless to the audience that they were shooting for. So little gotchas whenever it comes to translating, and especially whenever you're flipping the direction of language. There are some other meta tags that are important as it relates to translation, because it gives search engines a sense of context of where your content is from. In this example, we have a geo place name, a geo region, a geo position. All of that is schema.org metadata that basically can be added into the page that gives additional context for machines to know where that content resides. And it gives the context of, oh, if somebody's searching for this and they happen to be in the city of Portland, then we probably want to give them the city of Portland result. But if I searched for pay my water bill and geo-context-wise I'm closer to Seattle, I probably want to highlight the Seattle information higher, that kind of difference. It's also important to think about whenever you're looking at the metaname description, even though that doesn't boost your search results all that much, it is used for parts of the interface that outputs in terms of what you're seeing on the search results. So translating that is also important. In this case, I've got English up there, but if I were presenting the Spanish version of this page, I would want to present that meta description in Spanish. And the nice thing is Drupal does all this really well. Just the base core translation tools within Drupal, it will set meta tags based on the language of the page and actually enter the data that you've put for, say, a summary field into the description, that sort of thing. So this wall of code is kind of interesting and fun. This is implementation of the hreflang standard, which is basically a Google standard. It's kind of one of those weird one company standards that other companies have kind of adopted. IE will also look at a bit of this information, but as we all know, Google still reigns in the search market, so we often try to target them from how do we make sure things work. In this example, what you're seeing is all of the alternates for a canonical page. So just like in the previous slide where I have link canonical right here, that represents the page I'm looking at. If you're doing hreflang standard, then you can also provide an alternate for all the other languages for the page that you're looking at. Now you're like, well, why do I need to do that? Because certain languages have more weight with Google, and if Google knows, oh, that's the same as that US brand page that is really popular with us, we're going to go ahead and make that Great Britain brand page really popular with us. And so this hreflang standard basically allows you to kind of pass that information to search engines and says, rank me based on the most popular of this alternate, all the different alternates. And this one is interesting because every single one of these sites is a different Drupal instance, right? Mostly it's in multi-site. In this particular case, think of it as multi-sites where they're grouped by regionality so that they're actually hosted close to the home country that's closest from a hosting perspective to most of the languages. So I would end up with a European cluster, I would end up with a Southeast Asian cluster, I would end up with a North American cluster, that sort of thing. And the hosting would actually be as close as possible to that. Now, if you have a CDN with points of presence kind of around the world, you could do it that way as well. But you do, based on the documentation that Google has provided, you want to make sure that it's actually delivering up from an IP that's relatively close to the region in order to give it the best regional score. Yeah, go ahead.
When you say cluster and multi-site, you mean that in each of those regions, that's a single Drupal code base instance for Europe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this particular platform is fascinating. I could do a whole presentation on it. I'm a little rusty on it because it's been 5 years since I worked on it, but they actually had multiple brands on the same multi-site, and then they had little toggles that caused the different brands to show up. But they were doing it to basically save money on hosting in that case, just to make sure that they were doing the least total Drupal installations for what are fairly small, compact sites, but they're really brand optimized with language to try to get people in those regions to know about their product. If they do a search landing on there, where do I buy Clean and Clear Acne Care? Being able to give them a response for that's an accurate response for the region that they're in, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Just to give you a little sense of what that looked like here, if you can imagine, all of those Drupal sites had a site ID and a brand ID. And they would send that information along with their language code and country code to a Lambda script that would then say, oh, in my DynamoDB, I know about 3 more sites like that. Here, let me give you the lang code alternates for that. And so basically we orchestrated all those lang codes to be able to communicate back not to a mothership, but like this was the canonical reference. The DynamoDB represented all of the lane codes for every single brand site that was on this platform. And the glue that held it together was this set of scripts that kind of talked back and forth. Really cool implementation. I'm not getting super technical into it right now, but a lot of fun to think about, like how do you get Drupal sites that are not on the same instance to still communicate each other data, and this is one way to make that happen. So another thing to consider is that you want to index content in the language used by the user for your site search. And the better way to do this is to show it. So if I'm on portland.gov and I go to portland.gov/es/ I don't think we translated the path alias, so I think it was es/search still, but it is the Spanish search page. The thing that you will notice about that Spanish search page is everything on that page, all the interface had to be translated. And then we indexed all the content so that if you hit a Spanish search page and entered Spanish search terms, you get back Spanish results. So that's the key here. If you really want to do this well, index it in the database with language codes intact. Make sure that your views are using those language codes as part of their filtering and determining what content to return per language row. And that's going to give the best experience to the users that are working on that. And it's actually kind of funny because you speak Spanish, you can probably read most of this. And I think it's hilarious because I grabbed this screenshot the other day and I was really disappointed that the Pay My Water Bill service wasn't the first result. So I'm going to hit up the team and say, hey, why isn't the Pay My Water Bill the first result? Because it really should be.
Josh, is the whole site translated here? Or is there sections of the site that aren't included and then just wouldn't be circled?
That's a good question. So the question was, is the entire site translated here or is it just sections of the site? The strategy used here is each bureau chose from the 15 safe harbor languages that we had enabled, because we don't have every single language in the world available to editors to translate. But from those 15, which ones are most important based on the know your audience question, right? How many people do you have hitting this currently? How much outreach do you have coming in? And another good stat to look at for know your audience is how often do you get a call that's passed through a 711 service, which is like a translation service to come in to say, hey, how do I do this thing? All that data can feed into targeting the pages that will make the biggest impact. Now, in the particular example I gave here where I showed some Water Bureau pages, I know that they targeted like all of their information and service pages with their top 7 most used languages. So we knew Spanish was covered, but I know that I want to say it was also like Russian, Vietnamese, Chinese, pretty extensive kind of list that they targeted. I think I have another slide a little bit further on where you'll see another page that I grabbed where they've actually translated into several languages and you can see what the navigation looks like. But it is targeted. It's not everything, and the biggest driver behind that is the cost of the translation itself. It costs money to do translation.
I think, I'm not sure if it's a built-in thing, but for those who might not know, like let's say you have a link on your main nav and you don't have it translated in Spanish, then like it won't, like on the Spanish version of that page that has the menu, the link just won't appear. So it's not like you'll be directed to like an English page because you don't have it in Spanish. So that's a nice thing, that you don't need to have all the pages translated for fear of like, you'll be brought to an English page when.
Yeah, and a perfect example, there are some pages, particularly on government sites, where you don't want to translate them. For instance, your ordinances and resolutions and the city code and city charter, that should not be translated because it is legal language and translation might actually impact its legal meaning. And we don't have lawyers who can read 7 different languages. We have lawyers that can read English. So there are certain pages that you don't translate. Now the service that's defined in that city code and then offered, absolutely you want to translate that because that's the thing that the people interact with. But the law, you wouldn't. And so that's an example where you don't do full content, you do what is the subset that makes sense for that language.
I don't mean to derail, but that's a choice to hide languages and links in our translator. It's not a default. You can also choose to show the languages, right?
like if you don't have, well.
I'm saying
just-
that's what we do.
Oh, okay, yeah, well, and like an example that we had where it was like, there was a link on our header where like someone like unpublished the translation of that thing and then the button disappeared. It's like we have it set to only show content,
Yeah.
you know, or links to content like on the menu. That's why I'm not sure if that's just built in and if you have to change that, but that's how it looks on our site.
Yeah.
I actually have a slide for it that I'll show in just a second that actually shows a demo of it. So
What you just said made me curious. So I wrote down, don't translate legal docs. So when you're with the Google Translate service, what does that do when it comes across your terms?
oh,
of
it's still
service?
gonna attempt to translate it.
It would. It's
Yeah,
not- got
yeah.
it.
The trick there in terms of Google or AI, which I'm going to show some examples of like AI translating as well. That is a choice by the user to run it through that
So
service.
you can't be held liable for that.
Exactly.
Got it.
Google, as long as it's very clear that Google is providing the translation service, you're in the clear there. But I would actually argue a lot of that client side stuff I was talking about, where they've provided the translation switcher, there hasn't been a lawsuit yet. But because the organization is providing that translation switcher instead of providing real translation, I would actually argue that they might potentially be liable because they're saying that somehow. I know that one where you went to the disclaimer page and says you can't blame us for using this translation
That
thing.
instance.
They're probably okay.
Yeah.
Those that are relying on the browser to say, hey, do you want me to translate into Spanish? They're okay. But sticking that little translate widget up there, I think it technically could open up somebody to. I'm not a lawyer, but you know, I played one on TV, so. But it's possible. I've got a couple more slides, and I want to show the one that just shows how to show language switchers, because I think there's some important things to kind of talk through there. I will say, before I get to that, avoid mixed translation on a page unless you've properly encoded it so that it's clearly like showing that parts of the page are in English versus parts of the page are in Spanish. And there is actually that lang code or the lang attribute that you can apply to the HTML tag. You can apply that to an individual paragraph. And you can say this paragraph is in Spanish. And there's even a widget in CKEditor. It's a core widget to CKEditor and Drupal. Well, to CKEditor and Drupal, because Drupal actually has some settings where you can say basically only show the languages that I have configured on my site versus show me all of the United Nations language list, that sort of thing, which is a heck of a long list to give to editors to pick from. But you can actually target paragraphs and subparts of a page and say, oh, this little paragraph here, I put it in another language. But don't do this. This is an example from a client I'm currently working with and an editor that needs to be talked to. But not only is this not going to deliver from a search perspective, combining the languages into the title, it actually makes it harder for both the English speaker and the Spanish speaker to interact with this content. I don't know about all of you, but I look at this and my eyes glaze over because I'm like, part of that, my brain groks. The other part, my brain is like, I don't read that immediately. So it's that kind of mix that we want to avoid. And so don't do this. Avoid mixing translation on a page unless it's really targeted. And if you do have that really targeted mixed translation, make sure you're tagging it with the proper lang code around the element. And it's usually a paragraph element, especially if you're doing in CKEditor, because there's no way to tag it from a div element. I have done it at the span level, though, where you highlight a single word and say this one word is Spanish. And that works pretty well, too, because especially if you're saying here are a few different languages and the different lang codes that associate with those languages, it actually picks it up. And there's some things that search engines can do with that in terms of saying, oh, yeah, there was some Spanish content on this page. It makes sense to actually show this page.
So if you run that through TMGMT with Google Translate, will it ignore those?
Exactly. So if you're running it through another translation engine and you've got that sub part of your thing tagged, it's not going to say, oh, I'm translating this page from English to Russian. I see this Spanish word. I'm not going to try to translate the Spanish word into Russian as well because I'm translating from English to Russian. I don't even know what that word is. So it gives the system, the API, a little extra context. Make it clear what languages your site supports. Now, this is going to be the part where we look at like how do you do a language switcher and what can it look like. Multnomah County Library, and this is the old library site, so if you've been to it more recently, it's had a whole big refresh, but this was the one I helped implement, so it's a screenshot that I have. You can see here that this particular page is available in 5 languages. The way we did the picker in this particular case, if the language was not available, we actually disabled it and did a strike through, which from an accessibility standpoint might not be the most perfect way to do it, but it gave the context of, no, we really don't have this page translated into Vietnamese, or we don't have this page translated into Russian. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to do it. It was also a top bar sort of thing, so at any page that you were on, if you click that little switcher, it's changing it for the page that you're on. So it's not it's site-wide at that point, so then you go into that language and the rest of your links and the navigation and whatnot switch over to be that language. So that's a cool way to do it, shows it across the top. I've worked with some clients more recently that had, instead of 5 safe harbor languages, they had 15. That doesn't work for 15 languages because you basically take up the entire top bar, and it really wouldn't work on mobile because then when you collapse down that mobile navigation, you either have to hide it behind something that may not have the context of what language I'm working in, what have you. So what I often say at that point then is you want to give some sort of language switcher on your home page somewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be the top bar. If you're supporting 15 languages, it's probably going to be like closer to the footer. But you're putting that in there. Keeping in mind that the primary way, if you're actually doing translation, the primary way that people find your content is going to be back to search, right? They're going to actually discover it using their language and go to the correct page rather than having to start from your home page, selecting the language, and then having to navigate instead of using search. So in that case, if you've done it so that you're doing real translation, another cool way to do it is to do just little menus that say translate this page. Now you'll notice here that's in English, so that's not ideal, but then the only other word that's there is the language word, so it's pretty clear what that UI element is in any language that's there. If I clicked on Espanol, by the way, it would say translate this page in Espanol. I mean, like it would be in the target language, so the switcher's smart about it. And all that is, by the way, is a little view with some configuration to take in the language and the contextual argument of what page am I on. And then I personally like doing the title-based translations menu as well. And the reason why I like this one is because, it can be used a little bit easier by the end user because they actually get a full sentence of context. Instead of just the one word, oh, I want to see this word, I want to see my language, they're actually given a sentence that will explain to them what the page is about, that if they click that link, this is what it's going to do for them. And this is an example where you can see that they targeted 5 languages for this page. If they had done 7, there would be 2 more languages in the translate this page and 2 more titles in the translations menu. But it's kind of a good mixed way to provide that context of this is what we support and this is the real translation we have available for this content.
I have a quick question. So I like that this one even has the mention like translate this page, because I feel like the last example where it's on the top bar, and like you said, if you cross it out saying you might be wanting to tell the user this page isn't in that language, but I could see if they just landed on that, like they didn't start from the home page, they see that and they'll say, oh, the site is not in my language at all. It might just hop out. So was there any like, I guess, downsides of doing that strike through, or just like?
You know, I wish I had a little bit more data on the performance of the Multnomah County approach from back when we did it. Again, that Multnomah County site was like 10 years ago now, when we did the initial implementation. I know the folks, and actually Greg Boggs may even be here. He's one of the developers working on the site. He might have some information on like how it's performing now and what they're seeing after doing the upgrade to Drupal 10 and all the fun stuff that comes with that. I do know that when we did this for the city of Portland, we did some testing on what worked best, not only for providing the experience to the person that is a non-native speaker, but also what works best from a user interface standpoint. I think it's easy when you're doing a translation project to over-optimize for speakers of another language at the cost of making the page harder to use in every language. because that's a lot of UI that you're adding in potentially to give people the context of this is the translation. And so we made the choice with this one that because if you look at this in a mobile view, you basically get the title in English, you get the banner image for branding, you get the summary. By that time, you should know if this is the page you want or not. And then we present the, do you want this translated? Because maybe somebody has a language preference there. But the translations is actually way at the bottom because our sidebar drops to the bottom and it's at the very end. You'll notice that we used the English labels for the translations menu, and that is specifically for our editors. For them to, I shouldn't say just editors and people who provide support to the community, so that they know what link to give to someone if the question has been asked. Hey, how do I do this? And you're talking to them on the phone, or you're going back and forth with them on email. We wanted to make sure that there was context for the people who provide support to understand, oh, this is the language you want to deliver in that case. Another cool thing that you can do when you have like full translation, just like you can have page alternates in Drupal translation, you can actually do it with media as well. So what we did in this particular example, and this is with Washington County, is if they had a Spanish version of the document and they wanted that Spanish version of the document to show up on the page where they had embedded the English document, it just happened automatically. Now they have a little toggle where they can say hide this translation if they provide a full translation to the page. But if the only translation they have is just that document, this is a separate document link that has the proper tags surrounding it. So it has its lang attribute that says it's Spanish. It's the same media ID, it's just a different language, different file. So it's all tied in the same system. So when they go to edit their English document, they actually know, oh, I have translations in these 4 other languages for this document. I should update the files associated with this media entity for those languages as well. And this can be a really cool way to kind of just tie together all the translations to make it more clear what your translation coverage is as well. Because if you do all your files as separate entities and you've got a Spanish entity versus an English entity, you don't really know that that Spanish entity and that English entity are related. So this ties it all together in a really cool way. And I love that Drupal can do that with entity translation across all your content types, or all your entity types. So media, content, taxonomy, you can do it with all of them, block. Design your sites with culture. Design sites for cultures with tone and word length in mind. And this goes back to what was mentioned earlier about different dialects of a particular language. There are also different cultures. Like if you've got a global brand and you're targeting different language speakers, you're not just targeting different language speakers, you're also targeting the people from that country and what their most common beliefs are, and how they might react to your brand, and how your promotion of their brand is gonna work with them. So you want to keep all of that in mind. And the example I gave earlier with the hreflang, you have to have a tone that's appropriate to every single one of those languages. So if I'm talking about English US versus English Great Britain, I'm going to spell words with a Z versus an S, because they spell localize with a S and we spell localize with a Z. I'm going to have, colloquial language that is appropriate to them. I'm going to make sure that all works for their culture, which is more than just the language. It's that combination of language in place. The other thing to consider too is designing for word length. When you think about your navigation, how many words does it take to say that word in English versus Arabic versus German? If I have it in Arabic, what is it going to mean for that to go right to left? How is that going to change my ordering of all my content so that it actually kind of lays out the right way and stacks the right way in a mobile context? It's interesting too, because this really starts to play with your head whenever you're switching from left to right to left, and then thinking about order classes. I don't know how many of you have used a framework like, say, Bootstrap or something like that, and you've got order 1, medium, order 2, or order medium 1, order small 2. That way you're saying, I want this to be on medium, I want it to be the first thing, and small, I want it to be the second thing. you still get that same thing. It's all the ordering, but then you have to flip in your head the direction that you're going, because you're no longer working from a left to right float. You're working from a right to left float and incorporating that into your design system, whatever that might look like. But think about that when you have the culture. Also think about like culturally appropriate media for your translations. However, with a caveat, I would do that for a brand site. For a government site, I don't think you should swap out your photos on your pay your water bill page to try to match the language of the culture you're talking to. Just make sure you do good translation on the image and try to be multicultural in the imagery that you choose. But don't try to like target your media in that way. For brands, it makes sense because it's a completely different site and you're targeting a whole different culture. For government sites or sites where you've got a mixed usage but there's a singular tone, you can kind of work from that. Reduce translation costs with plain language. I used a little AI to give me a couple paragraphs here about landscaping. On the left, you have a paragraph written at a postdoctorate level. And on the right, you have an 8th grade level. It's about half. I probably could have asked it to summarize and done a couple more things to get it even shorter. But when you pay per word for translation, and usually, it's kind of crazy how cheap translation APIs are. We're talking like $20 for 1 million words. Like that's the typical ratio. So a lot of sites can translate a whole lot of things for a relatively low cost when you're working with the Translate APIs. The human review afterwards is where you're going to really spend your money. But it makes a big difference to start with plain, concise, simple language. It will totally change your translation budget if you start that way. I think all of us should get a little bit excited about AI translation. It's one of the very few areas of AI where I am excited. Everywhere else, I'm like, if I see one more clickbait headline generated by AI, I think I'm going to be a little sick. But this is exciting. If you haven't watched Dries' keynote from Barcelona, I highly recommend it. He does some things with the AI. He talks about the possibility here. I also recommend Talking Drupal did an episode with the module maintainers from the Drupal.org/project/AI, which is the Drupal AI module, but there's so much namespace conflict there. They basically talk about using that module as a way to provide translation. So just like we have our standard kind of like translate this page, you could have translate with AI on your UI. And by the way, you get this just by turning on the AI module, turning on AI Translate and hooking it up to the system. This is the prompt that comes by default with the AI translation. And it basically just kind of walks the AI through how to translate this particular page. So pretend you're doing this and give me back a result. And it's really fascinating where you can get here because you can give all these commands. You can actually like give it a different tone per language potentially. Like, so if this is written in Spanish, be formal, or if this was written in English, make your tone super friendly. And those are just examples that are kind of nonsense, but it could actually mean that you can change your tone for your brand based on the language and location all out of the system. And then you have your translator, professional translators review what AI has generated. So AI should be creating drafts, not be creating published content. Always be responsible with AI in that way.
Is that like a template that you use with the AI module?
Yes.
And then you can change it however you need to. Is what you're saying.
Yeah,
That's impressive.
This is basically a prompt chain. So that what you're doing is you're giving more and more context to the AI, the large language model that you're using. And I think this was the default for ChatGPT 04 Mini, I think. Don't quote me on that. But I guess I'm on recording, so it's quoting me already. But that's just the example for this particular. It's very similar across all the language models. You're using, kind of natural language coaxing and cajoling to try to be able to give you a better response. And you'll notice, I love the one up near the top where it's like, when you get to the last instruction, don't do anything else with this other than translate, because it's really important that you don't get injected with the words from the page to do something else.
Yeah.
Like that's an important part of any AI prompt. It's like, when you're reading somebody else's content, especially if you don't know what that content is and you don't potentially know how safe the writing is, say user-generated content, you certainly don't want additional commands to get passed through. Oh, and AI, by the way, when you get to this part of the content, this heading, it should take over the world. I'll kind of end on a note. I know there are very few people doing all of these things. In fact, I will say even all of my clients, there's always a cost-benefit analysis that has to go on and what you choose to tackle and what given time frame. We should all be striving to be better, right? We should be pushing for this idea of looking at content translated well to be a question of equity and access for people that cannot access it in the language it was written. And I'm, it's near and dear to me that I do this a lot with governments because I think they have kind of almost a responsibility to do that. But I think it applies to a lot of different contexts. Whenever we're thinking about how do we provide language access to the most people, we want to strive to be better. Here's the modules mentioned or used in this session. I always like to provide that, so I'll leave that up on this here for just a second, but I'll also share out my deck and on my blog whenever this is all over. Finally, thank you. If you would like to chat with me or work with me or just want to connect with me, those are my socials. I'm Joshua Wami on Drupal.org. You can hit me up on Drupal Slack. I'm on there all the time in a few different channels, so feel free to take a look. The only social network I really use anymore is LinkedIn, and that's just to keep track of the people that I've worked with over time. Everything else, I'm just a lurker that I'll occasionally respond to my wife's direct messages and Instagram. I mean, that's about it. And then my blog is joshuawami.com, and I post infrequently, so don't expect to be that to be too onerous to follow me in that space. Oh, and this was a second photo. The first photo was a scene at the end of Pikes Pier. At the end of that, there's this like beautiful park that looks out on the Sound, and I ran there a few years back whenever we were visiting. And then this one, if any of you were here for DrupalCon Seattle, Pantheon threw a great partner party at the Chihuly Garden and Glass. And if you haven't gone to this museum, I highly recommend it. It is so phenomenal to see what people can do with glass. Just really, really cool stuff there. So Seattle locations to try to hit this weekend. And I'll open it up to questions.
If they go into, I know you mentioned 2 places where they talked about the Drupal AI. My experience has only been with the just core translation module tool. So I saw that kind of prompt, like an idea of a prompt. Are you still able to, like if you want to swap out, like if you use files, what does that like interface, does it look like the core interface for translations? Like AI will do the content translation but let you swap out images, or how does that work?
So for right now, that would work with basically your CK editor field. It wouldn't do the rest of it. I think it's going to get better and better, and it's going to figure out how to do more and more things, especially since Drupal is so structured, and we can actually provide information that would be like, oh, hey, when you're translating this field, translate it, give me all the words for title, summary, and body. Don't translate my taxonomy because I'm actually translating my taxonomy with a separate translation process. Because most of your interface type things, when you're thinking about, taxonomies in 5 languages, or your menu UI, or your like form UI for, say, like your search box. All of that you're probably not going to translate with AI. That's going to use some other process. The example I gave with Portland.gov, we use the translation management module, the TMGNT, which I always feel like I'm saying Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles whenever I say that. I'm of a particular age. But all that to say, like when you use that module, it actually has this idea of queuing your translations. So you can say, I want to queue up this taxonomy, that taxonomy, this block, and it will generate a big, I believe the format is like po.text is the default, but there's different ones that, when we did it, we had it hooked up to the Google Translate API, and so it matched that JSON format that Google expected, submitted it to Google, returned back with a draft for all of those things for us to review and say, okay, yeah, I approve that translation, and we then suck it into the site. So for interface type translation, that's where I think you're still going to be using some sort of Google Translate API, Microsoft Translate API, Amazon has one. They all have a different one. They all have their various pros and cons. Do the searches there that you like best. I like the Google one. It's easy enough to use, easy enough to hook up. The API keys are all pretty straightforward, and it's pretty inexpensive. In terms of that $20 for 1 million words translation, that sort of thing. That can get you a long way with the interface. And then the AI thing that I think is going to be interesting is really the written content of, like, say, the body of a page, the body of an article, that sort of thing. And I would bet you, too, that if you were to try to do it with, like, paragraphs or something like that, it's not going to do it well. Like, it's going to do it well on those sites that have, a text field that it's interacting with. It's not going to build you a set of paragraphs, or if you're using Layout Builder, a set of Layout Builder blocks or that sort of thing. I don't think that's going to be a while before we're there. But do watch Dries's presentation, because it was pretty cool to see him build a content type using an AI prompt. I think that has some interesting implications for how we interact with building a lot of the boilerplate stuff that we do in Drupal. Between that and recipes really speeds up that process. But yeah, for the translation part, I would just think content areas for the most part.
Yes, so as I kind of implied, we're doing all these things wrong. Right? So,
do better. I mean,
do better, right?
yeah, strive.
So I'm going to go back and say, look, we provide our whole nav in translated pages to go to, even though only a fraction of the site is translated, we're providing the nav to all the English pages that are not translated. And this is, as a developer, has made me put a lot of time into blocking bots and slamming those pages. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, look, people are finding these in search. What is our data? What do people want? But what's my argument to the editorial and UX team to change our approach?
I think what is the argument to the editorial, the UX team to change the approach to follow more of these best practices?
Yeah.
And I think you can start with a cost argument. You can say, hey, can we shift our focus from we have to have everything translated by a human to let's take advantage to this relatively inexpensive first draft, and then our human translations are really for approval and review. I think that's one way that you can take it, because that could save you a significant amount of money. And it's not that it's going to reduce, for those contractors that are doing that work or services that have been procured for that work, it's not going to reduce how much they do. It's going to increase the amount of content on your site. So they're still going to be doing a lot of review work. They're just not going to be translating from scratch and using their own, because they're all using maybe not AI, but they're using translation engines and I'm trying to remember the technical term for it, but the library of words that they've built up for your site using a particular tone, and these are the words we're supposed to use in this situation. They're using that tool to determine their translations. So they're kind of like their own little large language model powered by humans. So maybe take advantage of that and increase the amount of content that you have to be reviewed while decreasing the amount of content that has to be translated from scratch.
Okay, thanks.
And then some of this other stuff, maybe like, show them some demos of it being done well.
Yeah. Do you have, did you have data showing, and this is what you're talking about safe harbor languages, this is what people, limited English speakers, are coming to our site through search, and then they need these things. And they prefer not to get the things that are random. So for example, one of our sites is the Oregon Zoo, and all the visitor pages are translated, but no events are translated. So we made a decision that the calendar should show the English events, because otherwise the calendar is blank. So I'm trying to,
Well, I mean,
that's the kind of.
the example of the events calendar that's kind of imbalanced because you don't translate it for every event. Maybe take advantage of that translation engine to generate the event translation. I know with Multnomah County, one of the things that came up is there were certain events where we did not translate them into every language because the event itself was in a particular language. So like the Chinese computer class, which was presented in Chinese, we didn't translate that to Spanish because boy, would that be weird. You know, you show up to a class thinking, oh, I'm going to get by on my passable English for this class, and no, it's like it's actually presented in Chinese. So it's totally not the right symmetrical translation situation. But for something like the Oregon Zoo, like, man, I can imagine there's lots of people that speak other languages that would love to know there was an event, because music is kind of like, if there's music going on at the zoo, everybody would know.
Smashing Pumpkins.
Elephant Smashing
Universal
Pumpkins. It's
language, right?
yeah, especially if Billy Corgan is playing along with it. That would be awesome.
I mean, I could see like, so we're like on the small, our sites are usually like max 5 to 10 pages, at least the Drupal ones. WordPress, we can have a different process, but like we have one internal person outside of me that really handles in-house translations if it's a site that small. And there's times when like, yeah, I can translate it, but I'm more focused on developing and building. So I could find that being like, free up her plate, do that draft, and then save her time for reviewing as opposed to starting from the beginning and having to translate. So I'd be really interested on seeing how that could work at our agency.
That translation management module with the API of your choice, and it lists all the APIs it supports. You can even do it so that it sends it to the translation service. There was a project that I didn't work on, but it was a phase 2 project with it was a cruise line, and I can't remember the cruise line name off the top of my head, but it was kind of cool. They actually had this whole thing where daily they would be within satellite reach on the boat, and it would send the text files to get translated to the translation service for like all their digital signage across the boat, and then all of that would get sent back and it would populate the digital signage, and that was all on Drupal. It was like this really kind of cool way of passing it back and forth. And I can't remember even what translation service that was, but there's so many cool use cases for using that translation management module to queue up translation to say, here's how you do things. And it actually will show you, like if you translate the English page, or you make an edit to the English page and you have other translations, it will flag all the other languages as outdated, which is also really powerful, I think, from being able to say, we just edited this English page. Was it a trivial, like I moved a comma, or was it I changed this paragraph and now I need to populate that paragraph to my other languages? So something else to look at. Well, it looks like we are at time. I appreciate you all with great questions and good conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.